So back in our main Dart file, we have that main function. As you know, this is a function. It returns nothing, takes no arguments, and right now we also have nothing in the function body. Now, as you learned, main is a function which automatically is executed when the app starts by Flutter and Dart, because it's in the main.dart file, which you therefore also shouldn't rename. Now, in here, we need to add some code that actually brings something onto the screen. For that, it's important to understand that on the screen, we basically see a bunch of widgets. Flutter is about widgets. It's so important to understand this. Every Flutter app you're building is just a bunch of widgets, and widgets are the UI building blocks you see on the screen. Things like the app bar, maybe some image, maybe a list with list items. And as you can see here, for example, widgets also often contain other widgets, like that list which has list items. So you compose your Flutter app as that tree of widgets, which I already mentioned before, which has a root widget, which is your entire app, and in there you have your other widgets, which yet might hold other widgets thereafter. Even your entire page, so the entire thing that holds all the widgets on your page, on your screen, is a widget in Flutter. So since everything in Flutter is a widget, and since the entire app is a widget, we probably need to create such an app widget, which then has other widgets to see something on the screen. And that's 100% correct. Now, to create such a widget, we need to create a class, because a widget is a special type of object, so to say. And you learned that you need classes to create objects. So let's add a class here, and you can give it any name you want, and I will name it my app, following that naming convention, which is called Pascal case, where you have a capital starting character, and then every word inside the word also starts with a capital starting character. No blanks in between, no underscores, no dashes. Your classes should be named like this. The concrete name, if this is my app, my cool app, or something else, is totally up to you. Now, this would be a class, but as you probably can imagine, a widget that really can be seen on the screen is not that trivial to create, because in the end, the pixels on the screen need to be controlled. Now, thankfully, we don't have to write that logic on our own. Flutter does all of that behind the scenes. And therefore, our class here now uses a feature called inheritance. That means that it builds up on a base class, gets all the features of that base class, and only adds new features to it. We do inherit by adding the extends keyword here after the class name before the curly braces. That informs Dart that this class will be based on some other class, and you can only extend one class at a time. Now, the class I do want to extend here is not a class we will write, but a class provided by Flutter. Now, of course, in our whole project here, we only have one Dart file in the lib folder, and that's our own Dart file. But please remember that we have that pubspec file where we define which dependencies our application has, or our Dart project has. And here we have one dependency, and that's Flutter, the Flutter framework. Now, the files of that framework are not stored here in that project. Instead, they're stored somewhere else on your machine, typically in your user folder somewhere. But you can import from these files because the connection is established with the help of this entry in the pubspec.yaml file. So now in the main Dart file, we can inform Dart that we want to reach out to some other file, in this case from the Flutter framework, that gives us the class which we wouldn't want to extend here. We do that by adding the import keyword. This tells Dart, hey, I want some functionality which is not in this file, but which is in some other file. Now you can point at your own files there too, and we'll do that later, but you can also point at third-party packages which are part of your project. You do this by adding package : and then the name of the package, which in this case is Flutter. And then a lot of packages have a lot of files that make up this package. So you can add a slash here and then point at a concrete file. In this case, this would be material.dart. That's one of the files the Flutter framework exposes to you. It has a lot of built-in widgets following the material theming. And later you will also learn how to make your apps look good on iOS, but material themes also work on iOS. And besides these pre-styled material-looking widgets, the material Dart file also has a base class which allows you to create your own widgets. And that's the stateless widget class. So we extend stateless widget here, and this now turns our class into a class which can be used as a widget by Flutter. However, now we got a new error here, that it's missing a correct implementation of stateless widget.build. Now what does this mean? Now .build signals that this seems to be some property, so a variable, which is part of that class. Or maybe it's a function that's part of the class. We haven't had a look at this before, but besides variables, you can also have functions inside classes. Now, variables inside of classes would be called properties. Functions inside of classes are called methods. So we have to add a special method here. Now, how do I know that it's a method and not a property? It's just something you have to memorize, one of the very few things you have to memorize. So here, this is a method which is missing. So let's add build here. Since it's a method and therefore effectively a function, we can add parentheses here. We have to add them and curly braces to mark the body of that function. Now functions can take arguments, and if we hover over this to read the error here, we actually see that it isn't a valid override, whatever that means, of the build method, and indeed it should take a build context as an argument. So let's add an argument here. You can name it CTX or context, whatever you want. It's a special type of object, a special object, which will be passed into the build method automatically, because you will never call that method. Flutter will call it whenever it needs to draw something onto the screen. And context is an object into which I'll dive deeper later. In the end, it holds some meta information about our app and about this widget we're building. But for now, let's just add it. And let's also add a type annotation. The type is build context, which is in the end a class that is also defined in material Dart, which is why we can use it here. So build context is a special object type provided by Flutter in the material Dart file, and this context object is of that type, and we get it automatically by Flutter. Now build is also a function or a method which returns something. It needs to return a widget, because you work with the widgets in Flutter. Your entire app is a widget. We're trying to build an app here. The build function is what Dart and Flutter will call in the end when they try to draw something onto the screen, and therefore the build method here needs to return a widget. Now, just like build context, widget is in the end a class, and every class automatically then also is a type, which is provided by material Dart. Now we need to return such a widget here inside of my app. And there is a special widget which we should return, and that's the material app widget. Also provided by material Dart. That's a widget provided by the Flutter team, which does some base setup to turn your combination of widgets into a real app that can be rendered. It does a lot of heavy lifting behind the scenes, you could say. Material app also takes a couple of arguments. As you can see, it's a pretty long list, and all these arguments are so-called named arguments. Now, thus far, we only saw something which are positional arguments, which means the build method takes an argument, context, and because it takes one argument, we accept it like this by giving it a name in the end, and the first and only argument which will be passed into build when Flutter calls the build method will be passed into context, or will be available as context. In our example here, we had two positional arguments in add numbers, num1 and num2, and what we passed in as a first argument here when we called the function would end up in num1. What we passed in as the second argument here would end up in num2. Now, material app uses so-called named arguments, which means we don't pass in data in order here, but because that has a lot of possible arguments we can set, which are all optional in the end, we target the argument by its name. And there, for the moment, we only need the home argument. Home is basically the core widget which Flutter will bring onto the screen when this entire app is mounted to the screen. And here we could use a text widget, which is yet another widget built into Flutter. And you will work a lot with these built-in widgets because thankfully you rarely have to reinvent the wheel and all the core UI building blocks you need in modern apps already exist. Text takes a string, you learned about that data type, which you can create with single or double quotes, as an input, and here we could print hello. So now we have that material app widget, which is provided by Material Dart, with that named argument, which, in case it's not entirely clear, is something we'll also use throughout this course, and we'll also create our own functions that take named arguments so that this becomes clearer. And then here we also have hello, which we pass to text. Now, as a side note, if you're wondering whether Material App is a function or a class, it is a class, and yet we can pass data to it with a feature called a constructor, but that's also something I'll come back to later. For now, let's just accept that this is some code which will create something which can be treated as an app, because Material App does a lot of heavy lifting behind the scenes, and which should also output some code. Now we just need to wire up that main function with this class here.